We're learning new details about the man many consider to be at the center of the Trump administration's immigration policies. White House senior advisor Stephen Miller has been instrumental in the crackdown at the southern border. He's also been involved in creating the travel ban on several Muslim-majority countries. A New York Times report out this week details the 33-year-old's political rise. It says Miller now occupies a large West Wing office and has influence on virtually every element of immigration policy, from the words the president uses to the regulations he promulgates. New York Times senior writer Jason DeParle wrote that piece, and he joins me now from Washington. Jason, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit more about Stephen Miller's views on immigration and his scope of influence at the White House?
His views on immigration are easy to summarize. He doesn't like it. He doesn't like it in virtually every form. Obviously, he's against illegal immigration. He's also against legal immigration. He's against refugees. He's against high-skilled immigration. He's against low-skilled immigration, temporary immigration, permanent immigration. I think what distinguishes him is the adamance, the vehemence that he brings to the subject.
And you sort of write that he's in some ways a product of his times. You know, he was raised in the post-9/11, Muslim paranoia, and he found a niche for himself in a sort of liberal pocket of California, where he sort of got a lot of attention for some of his views, and he's been able to take that to a larger stage. Can you summarize, I know we don't have time to talk about everything in your article, but sort of how he was able to go from being that outspoken high school student to this position of power in the West Wing?
Well, I think he's a product of his times in two ways. He came of age in Southern California at exactly the time when California was becoming a majority-minority state, and he had deep concerns about assimilation, fears that it wasn't happening, that he often expressed in high school. And he was also a product of the post-9/11 climate. He was a high school junior when the 9/11 attacks killed nearly 3,000 people. And I think that helped firm his adamance about letting foreigners in the country. He started as a low-level Capitol Hill aide and rose quickly in the GOP.
It's interesting that you read about some of his high school, classmates weren't sure whether he was serious with some of his, inflammatory rhetoric.
Yeah.
It appears now that he was serious, but he kind of couched it almost in a campy way, it seems.
That's a good description of it. Yeah, he once ran for student government and got up in front of a liberal student body and derided the work of janitors. Said he was sick and tired of being told to clean up his own trash when they had janitors for it. Some people were deeply offended, and some people thought it was all just a spoof. I think he's always had an element of that performance art to him, and it persists even in the White House briefing room today.
And could that element of performance be what caught President Trump's eye? Because as we know, he likes a good performance as well.
He's a performance artist as well, isn't he? Yes. President Trump, Stephen Miller during the campaign would often warm up the rallies when Trump was doing his rallies and lead them in chants of, build the wall and lock her up. Miller was kind of the warm-up act for that. I think President Trump appreciates that element of him.
Now, you write that going back even further before Miller was born, going all the way back to 1965, you can trace the roots of some of this anti-immigrant sentiment that Miller just sort of rode the wave of in some ways. Starting with the Johnson administration, tell us what happened then and how it sort of shifted this idea of immigration from something that the GOP, or at least the business-centered GOP, actually embraced, to something that is now, the opposite of what the Republican Party wants to embrace.
I think we're returning really not only to the 1920s. In the early 1920s, Congress, for the first time, put national origin quotas on immigration to keep out Eastern and Southern Europeans. What Johnson did in 1965 was to lift those as part of the civil rights movement, to make immigration not discriminate against people by their country of origin. He promised it wouldn't increase the number of immigrants or do much to change the nation's ethnic mix. It did both. And I think the movement that Stephen Miller represents is very uncomfortable with the level of rapid ethnic change that that law has produced.
But even that element within
Before
the
that law, about 90% of immigrants were white, and after that law, about 90% of immigrants were non-white.
But it was so interesting that even that element of the GOP party, that sort of strident anti-immigrant element, was not the driving force. I mean, you say that the business-oriented side of the Republican Party welcomed the cheap labor, even all the way up to George Bush, who saw the Hispanic immigrants as potential, proto-Republicans, family-oriented, conservative in many ways, and he sort of supported that. There was a big turnaround, though, after 9/11, correct?
It's easy to forget that there was once a substantial faction of the GOP that favored immigration, including a figure as foundational as Ronald Reagan. When he accepted the presidential nomination in 1980, he hailed the presence of immigrants in the United States as proof that God made America a city on the hill. And stretching from Reagan to George W. Bush, as you say, who wanted to make the party favorable to immigrants. He held the first Cinco de Mayo celebration in the White House.
Right.
I think the 9/11 attacks, among other things, was a big factor in changing the dynamics of the debate.
And hence Stephen Miller's rise. How far do you see his influence in the White House going?
On this one issue, he exercises extraordinary control. President Trump has instincts. I think Stephen Miller has policy knowledge. He knows how to operationalize those instincts. I think Trump trusts him to really run the whole portfolio.
Well, Jason DeParle, thank you so much for putting his rise into some historical context for us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.